welcome. You're watching the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna. The decision last evening to transfer roughly 1.76 lakh crore rupees as surplus by the Reserve Bank of India to the central government has come after a number of twists and turns. The decision was made after a committee headed by former RBI Governor Dr. Jalan recommended a new economic framework for how the central bank provides for contingencies and how much it can give to its owner, essentially the Government of India. But the reason you're seeing so much debate around it goes beyond this accounting. For one, former governors and RBI officials ranging from Raghuram Rajan to D. Subbarao to Viral Acharya have cautioned in the past against the government dipping into RBI reserves. It's widely believed former Governor Urjit Patel stepped down because of this difference of opinion between the RBI and the government. The transfer has also seen some raise questions about the autonomy of the Reserve Bank that has remained above board, even though it is the government's banker. On the other hand, from what is available of the Bimal Jalan report, it seems that a fine balance has been struck between giving the government a free pass with RBI's reserves and the central bank sitting on top of excess money. Nevertheless, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman made it a point to hit out at detractors of this move today.
The Bimal Jalan committee had eminent experts in it. It was constituted by the Reserve Bank themselves and not by the government. They have had several sittings and have said or have come out with a formula based on which the amount is arrived at. Now, any suggestion about the credibility of the Reserve Bank, therefore for me, seems a bit outlandish. Comments being given on the credibility of the Reserve Bank, I'm afraid, is commenting on the Reserve Bank itself and their selection of the committee itself and their arriving, the committee independently arriving at a formula itself. It's very worrying that a committee appointed by the Reserve Bank of experts who have had several meetings and have come with a formulation is now being questioned.
All right, a number of things to discuss. First is the criticism, and some of it is political, but not all of it, that the government is raiding the RBI's reserves. Is that criticism valid at all? Secondly, is there any question after this on the autonomy of the RBI? And of course, the biggest question of all, what's the government going to do with all of this excess cash? To discuss this further, I'm joined now by R. Gandhi, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Indira Rajaraman, former member of the 13th Finance Commission, Surjit Bhalla, former member of the PMEAC, R. Gopalan, former Finance Secretary, and Maithili Bhusramat, Consulting Editor, ET Now. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us on the show this evening. Mr. Gandhi, let me begin with where you stand on the debate which is raging so far on whether the surplus this time round, and one of the reasons it's raised eyebrows is because it's about 3 times what the government got last year, about 500 crores. This time is 1.76 lakh crore rupees. Do you think there are valid criticisms of the amount that has been transferred and whether it questions the autonomy of the RBI?
Not at all. These criticisms are unfounded, and in my opinion, it is misinformed. As you can clearly see that out of the total 1.76 lakh crores that is sought to be transferred to government, 1.23 lakh crores is out of the current year profit. So that in any case Reserve Bank has been doing for the past 5 years. Whatever is the entire surplus without any addition to its reserves, it had been transferring to the government, and on that basis this 1.23 stands as transferred to the government. So if you remove that what exactly is coming out of the earlier resource built up, that relates to that provision, rewriting the provision to the extent of 53,000 crores. So that is what, if at all it can be said that government has got out of the past reserves that Reserve Bank has built up.
Right.
So this 1.76, the big number, major part of it comes out of the current year surplus. That's why it cannot be concluded, or anybody would say that the Reserve Bank's independence or autonomy has been disturbed by this measure.
Okay, Indira Rajaraman, I'm just going to start with everyone's opening comments to set the pace of the debate. Ms. Rajaraman, where do you stand on the conversation and the narrative over what has happened in the last 24 to 48 hours? Of course, the controversy has been going on for a while for those who track it. But is it that big amount which has caught people's eye?
I actually think the Jalan committee did an excellent job because all their recommendations were backed by careful argument, and the most important thing they did was to place the revaluation reserve out of reach of the government by defining the risk tolerance limit such that the revaluation reserve could be added to but not subtracted from. That was the key decision which reduced the stock transfer to government to as little as roughly 53,000 crores from, if you remember, the numbers that were bandied about earlier, like 3.6 lakh crore.
Okay, there's also some question about, that range, the CBR range from 5.5 to 6.5%. The Reserve Bank has chosen to take the lower end of the range this time round, which has led to an excess surplus of 52,000 odd crore rupees. Do you think that raises a question at all, Ms. Rajaraman?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yes. Well, the Jalan committee placed the decision as to whether to go with 5.5 or 6.5 or any number in between.
Yeah.
They left the decision to the board. And the board, in their judgment, decided to stay with 5.5, the lower end. One can't exactly fault them for it because that was an option that was given to them.
Okay, let me get in Surjit Bhalla on how you are seeing the entire debate framing up. So far, we've had our panelists say that it's a good decision and shouldn't be faulted. Do you agree with that, Mr. Bhalla?
Yeah, well, I agree completely with that. Plus, if I can add, let's go beyond as to what is the problem. From the way I see it, that the problem can be seen as an expansion of the fiscal deficit, and that there might be some bad expenditures involved. Let me take the second part first, that is bad expenditures on the part of the government for whatever the surplus is transferred over from by the RBI. In terms of bad expenditures, nobody's yet talked about bad expenditures. What people have talked about is basically recapitalization of banks, putting in roads or whatever, essentially positive public goods or something that the government should be doing. Then we are left with, and bad expenditures would be dropping helicopter money, okay, or giving it to Narega or whatever. Then we have, what about the expansion in the fiscal deficit? Then we have to really answer the question. And let us assume for a moment that this will expand the fiscal deficit by whatever amount, 0.4, 0.5, whatever amount you choose to. What we then have to answer, does this expansion of the fiscal deficit lead to higher inflation, which will be a bad, and leads to higher growth, which will be a good? And if both occur, then we have to weigh whether the good outweighs the bad. To the best of my knowledge, nobody, whether in India or in the world, has shown any relationship of fiscal deficits with inflation, none whatsoever. So you know that about 2 years ago, the RBI itself issued a note saying that because of the expansion of the fiscal deficit, that we would have inflation expanding by about 50 to 100 basis points. What happened? Inflation fell. Now, that's only a one-time event,
Yes.
but you study the data for any country in the world other than Zimbabwe or some hyperinflation country, empirically you do not find any relationship whatsoever. So I think the debate should be on whether the money spent will be well spent.
Yeah.
And on that, I think the record of this government particularly is very, very good.
Okay.
And all the options talked about by the critics as well as by everybody else is for good expenditures. So
All right.
honestly, I don't know what the debate is about.
All right, I'll come in a little bit of detail further on to the question of what we should actually do with the money now that is there. But R. Gopalan, from what we've heard so far, then my question simply is that if there is no problem, there is no question, then why did we have to see this long, arduous, painful process to come to this point where you have a new economic framework in place and you could have this amount of a transfer given out? Why did we then see big names and worthies like Viral Acharya, Urjit Patel, Raghuram Rajan cautioning against this kind of a transfer? Can you explain that to us, sir?
Well, it's a very complicated question. Let me say that in 2013 there was a Malagam committee which indicated what the surplus could be, and which Mr. Rajan transferred during his period. For a 3 years period of time, he transferred the entire surplus identified by Mr. Malagam. Now after that, then there was a view that because of various other factors which are international and domestic, there was a need to be more conservative, and therefore the Rajan and Urjit Patel, for their own reasons other than this also, they resisted transfer of reserves for establishing a bad practice or whatever. And the question at that time was, Fisc was in great difficulty, and therefore it would be seen as raiding the RBI, and therefore the RBI independence will be compromised. These were the views that were floating around at that point in time. Probably now that had to be quelled with an expert committee, and expert of eminence like Dr. Jalan, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, and all others who were there. It was a well thought out. I get the information that they did lot of exercises in arriving at what should be the numbers which they should recommend as reserves to be kept, and it was born out of a good exercise. And I think a report, as Ms. Rajaraman points out,
Yes.
is a good report. They are given some choice to RBI to take a decision on, but I would still feel that given the current situation, and even in the face of the fact that Jalan committee has pointed out that there should be development of methodologies for assessing concentration risk in forex portfolio,
Yeah.
as well as jointly assessing RBI's market credit risk, there seems to be something wanting there. So in the face of it, should RBI board has gone ahead and recommended a lower bound of 5.5
Yeah.
instead of somewhere in between, is a question which will be debated, and we will have some views on it over a period of time.
Okay, let's debate part of that question now. Maithili, how do you look at the events, and of course you were going through them when the first decision was out last evening, but over the last 24 odd hours, when you've had a chance to look through what the RBI has actually recommended and the history that precedes this, how do you look at the situation we are in right now and what this transfer of surplus actually means? Because it's clear that beyond the actual numbers, and of course the size of the number is what is catching everyone's eye, it's also become a question about the independence of the Reserve Bank of India.
No, I think that would be pushing it too far, because it really doesn't in any way impinge on the independence or the credibility of the Reserve Bank of India. I think the most significant takeaway from the report really is that we finally have a methodology, we finally have a framework. In the past, why both Urjit Patel and Raghuram Rajan, they had that fracas with the government, was because it was a very arbitrary number that was floating around, and that was highly objectionable. You needed to have a clear set of rules, and that's the biggest service that the Jalan committee has done. We now have have a clear set of rules. You might disagree with the methodology, you may agree with the methodology, but nobody can question the motives. It's become institutionalized, and I think that is the biggest contribution of the Jalan committee. I would entirely agree with Mr. Dr. R. Gandhi as well as Indira that what the Jalan committee has done is really yeoman's work, and in future going forward, no government or the Reserve Bank will have to fight and say no, this is excessive, this is not sufficient, because we now have a clear framework.
Okay, let's then go into a bit of detail and understand where this number has really come from and why it has raised so many questions. Mr. Gandhi, I'll also first take to you the point that Mr. Gopalan made. If your option was 5.5 to 6.5%, why did you come to 5.5%? Is it important to shake off this perception, and whether it's right or wrong, that this has happened because of a bit of a nudging from the government? Right now, we are not in the best shape economically, and this cash is useful.
Yeah, that's right, because if you are a conservative central banker, you would always argue for a higher end of the range that has been given, that is 6.5. So those kind of arguments will come once you have the conservative approach. Possibly, given the background of last 1.5 years discussions, expectations which have been created in the public space, there were numbers like 3 lakh crores, 5 lakh crores, 6 lakh crores were being branded about what should be transferred to the government. The board might have thought that it is because it still gives that option. The Jalan panel had given that option. You can decide between 5.5 to 6.5. So they had kind of decided in favor of the lower bound. Actually, yes, left to myself, I would like to be a conservative central banker. My own individual recommendation could be something else, but the board has taken that decision after due consideration that we should. Yes, by keeping at 5.5, one strong factor which everyone has to recognize is that going forward in the next fiscal, to keep up that 5.5 itself, Reserve Bank will have to take a sizable portion of that year's surplus into the reserves to maintain that 5.5. So next year the government cannot expect the complete transfer of the whole surplus. That automatically comes in. So it is a question of recognizing that what is the downline implication of that decision. I suppose that they would have factored in, and government would have also accepted that. Based on that, it has been done. So yes, when the range has been given, why somebody has taken the lower range, why it should not have been somewhere middle or up, that is not the right way to debate. That's what I think.
Okay, so Mr. Rajaraman put in an interesting perspective that if you have a choice, why not? I guess it's more about the timing. Mr. Bhalla, how do you look at it? Part of it is because look at the entire situation. The government has essentially already budgeted that they will get 90,000 crore rupees. There's already been some transfer of about 28,000 crore rupees, so they're going to get about 58,000 crore rupees more. It's money that is desperately needed. What we will do with it is a good question, and I'll come to that in just a bit. But this scenario, along with the fact that the Reserve Bank of India has chosen to go for the lower end of the range, along with the fact that there has been a near open spat between previous governors and very senior officials from the Reserve Bank and the government on the transfer of money. What picture does that paint, and do you think that impression needs to be dispelled?
Yeah, okay. Let's assume for a moment there was no spat, no controversy, and we had the Bimal Jalan committee set up from scratch. Okay? So let's remove all of those considerations in order to look at what they have done. Now, do you think that they would have come up with a precise percentage? No. Most economists, most policy analysts, most government officials around the world feel that fiscal policy should be counter-cyclical. That is to say, when the economy is down, there is more expenditure, and when the economy is less, there is less. When the economy is doing well, there's less expenditure. That's why the Occam's razor is that's why there's a range. And this time, because everybody admits that the economy is in a downturn, I mean, your GDP data shows you, so you don't have to worry whether the data is right or wrong. The official GDP data says that from 8%, we are down to 5.8%. Therefore, I think, you start from scratch, you would come up with the answer that the Jalan committee has come up with. Whether it was 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, we don't know. But they had to come with a range because that's the essence of fiscal policy.
Okay, that's what they had to do. The question is about what the Reserve Bank had to do. Ms. Rajaraman, you've answered that question in part. That's why I will come to you to the next of this one.
Same thing.
Okay.
Same thing.
Okay, to the next of this one that Mr. Balla in fact has played out. What's important now is what the government does with the money. And there have been a number of theories and recommendations floating around. The finance minister was asked about it, so she said, I have no answer right now, and they'll probably take it into consideration. What in your view should be the best use? And I just want to tack on another question. Do you think that there is any concern about the precedent it sets? Because it's not about this government or next government or which one comes in. Once you've set a precedent that, you can get these reserves, the Reserve Bank will use the lower end of the range, and this is sort of an option when you're in a bad shape. Do you think that raises any concerns at all? Answer to both questions, please.
On the first question, what is the best use to which this money can be put? I don't know that I really want to answer that. In a certain sense, it's irrelevant at this point. The Jalan committee investigated very carefully, in my opinion, and responsibly, what was the right sum to be transferred. I don't think any reasonable person can disagree with the approach they took and with the numbers they arrived at. Beyond that, it was not their task, nor indeed ours at this point, to question what use the money will be put to. Let us also remember that in the budget estimates for this year, there was an expectation that there would be 90,000 crores from the Reserve Bank. That's not too different from the 95,000 crores which they are essentially getting after subtracting from the 1.23 lakh crore, the 28,000 crore that was given as an interim dividend last year. The bonanza that they got was the transfer from reserves of roughly 53,000 crores, and that has been very carefully argued. Yes, it was an outcome of the choice of 5.5% as the lower end, at the lower end of the range of the prudential range that was prescribed by the Jalan committee, and the board was within its rights to choose the lower end. As Mr. Gandhi correctly pointed out, next year when the balance sheet grows, there will have to be some restoration to the contingency reserve buffer of sums from the surplus of the RBI in order to keep it at 5.5%. But clearly the board thought that at this juncture it was better to front load the fiscal push needed for the economy, and that's what they chose. Once again, the uses to which this will be put by the government is in a certain sense not asked to investigate. That's another issue.
Well, but that's what debate shows are made of. So in light of that, I have this excellent panel here. Which is why I want to know what all of you think. So I will come to the others on this point as well. Maitri, I just want to dial back, to the broader perspective and why people are debating this. Why, in fact, the Congress party has come out and raised a hue and a cry. A number of economists, academicians have as well. It's not like it has been without controversy at all. And at the nub of it, there seems to be sort of a long-ranging difference of opinion, fight, whatever you may call it, something that you have covered in depth as well, where the government and the RBI, or the finance ministry and the RBI, always find themselves at loggerheads. It's a push and a pull. And has anything changed hence on in that power equation? Will successive governments also now deal with the new equation responsibly?
Well, I don't think anything really has changed for the worse. In fact, if at all, it's changed for the better because you now have a definite framework. So that's why I said that future governments cannot pull an arbitrary number out of the hat and say this is the amount that you must transfer, because now you have a very clear framework how you are going to look at the economic capital of the Reserve Bank of India, what can be tapped and what cannot be tapped. So I think this is a very good thing. We've institutionalized the system and you've ensured that there is no way that the government can step on what is strictly the RBI's turf. As to Indira's steering away from the question of what should the government do with the money, I'm afraid both as a journalist and as a tax-paying citizen of this country, I have a lot of ideas of what the government should do with the money, and I think it is for us as citizens of this country to tell the government what to do with the money, simply because governments have not always been very responsible about how they have spent the money. So I certainly think that this money should not be frittered away. It should be used to either buy back some of government debt or to recapitalize public sector banks, certainly not on revenue expenditure. So I think it's perfectly, par for the course for all of us to come out and tell the government what should they do with their money.
Yeah, so
it's our money.
Why don't you start, Maitri, while I take that round of questions to the rest of the panel. Why don't you start with your recommendations?
Voice.
Well, what I would recommend to the government right away is that why don't you recapitalize the banks? You've spoken about recapitalization of banks, you've talked about 70,000 crores, and that was in the budget on July 5th. Today we're into the end of August and that recapitalization hasn't happened. That is in fact the single perhaps closest silver bullet that you could get to get the economy back on the tracks, because if banks get that money they will start lending again. We will not be so worried about what's happening with the NBFC space. So I think this is the first thing that the government should immediately do. We already have a provision for it in the budget, so why not go ahead and do it? This is money it's fallen from heaven, it's manna from heaven. Go ahead and use it. Don't fritter it away, but don't hesitate. Recapitalize the public sector banks and do it fully and boldly.
Has it fallen from heaven and how much money is there? Let's just take a look at this quick graphic we've put together. So like Maitri rightly said, the budget estimate was for about 90,000 crore rupees coming in from the RBI. They've already got, the government has already got an advance transfer of 28,000 crore rupees. So that leaves it with about 58,000 odd crore rupees. So what do you do with that? R. Gopalan, what are your views on this? Okay, I'll get back to R. Gopalan in just a bit. Sujit Bhalla, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with what Maithili said. There's good expenditures and there's bad expenditures. One possibility, as she rightly said, I agree with. This money could go towards recapitalization of banks. The other expenditure, the other area where this money could go to, and this is something I have consistently argued, and it's something contained in the HLAG report for the Commerce Ministry, that should go towards reduction of taxes, especially corporate taxes. The government has said that we will reduce the corporate tax rate to 25% for all firms. Well, this is the time to now engineer that and perhaps even reduce the tax rate further. So I think it's easily identifiable that individuals will broadly fall in the same camp as what is good expenditure and what is bad expenditure. I agree with Maithili again that revenue expenditure will generally be considered bad expenditure at this stage, but not investment expenditure and not recapitalization of banks and not the cutting of taxes. So there's a whole host of things, good things that the government can do, and let me add that they should do with the money.
Okay, let me come to Mr. R. Gandhi for how you see this going through, what the government can do at this point. Recapitalization of banks seems to be the popular sentiment here. So there is a view that this is not going to create more capital at this point. It's just maybe going to get banks up on their feet. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, the comments that I am going to give now is not as a central banker or ex-central banker. This is pure and a keen observer of the economy.
Okay.
From that perspective, I want to present this.
Yes, of course.
If the Reserve Bank board had decided in favor of lower bound of the range at 5.5 because the current economic situation demands greater resources in the hands of the government, if that is the starting argument, and around this time, because there is a general consensus that the economy has slowed down, so that would mean that there has to be a extra effort from the government side to support or prime the economy. That would mean that immediate expenditure in the form of going towards consumption will certainly be yielding higher results than directing this particular set of extra money towards investment oriented options, like whether it is recapitalization of banks and other thing, because that will give benefits in the medium term, whether it is buying back of the government bonds or recapitalization. That will take a longer time, whereas consumption related expenditure will pump up consumption demand within the country. That will be my my take on this, where this money should be spent.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and with all the caveats you gave, but Mr. Gandhi, can I ask you to go into that in a little more detail? When you talk about consumption led expenditure, can you elaborate that on a little more?
Yeah, because as of now, out of the four possible engines any economy can have, one is export, the consumption, investment, and the government expenditure. Of these four, the export obviously, of course, Dr. Balla did mention that some incentives could be thought about for supporting export out of these funds. Yes, that will be certainly useful. The investment, that's one I was thinking that is going to take a longer time. So if you are wanting quick return out of this money that is spent, then the options are either government expenditure or supporting consumption. That is where the government should think about transferring this money, which will result in increase in the consumption demand in the country.
Okay, let me come to R. Gopalan. On, I don't know if you've missed some of the debate which went on in the last few minutes, Mr. Gopalan, but we're now effectively
Yes,
we are asking.
I did.
Yeah, we have.
I did.
Once you do the math, apart from what the government already budgeted for, what it's already got from this 1.76 lakh crore rupees is about 58,000 crores, and we've been discussing how then it should be used, considering the backdrop that we're in right now. We know that we're in the middle of a slowdown. So what can the government do with this money? One popular point of view has been that use it to recapitalize banks.
Well, I mean, the government is already going through the bond route for recapitalization of banks. I don't think they will dip into this money for recapitalization of banks. Number two, you see, the revenue projections for collection are little optimistic, and there are reports that on the current way the collections is going on, there is going to be 0.5 to 0.6% of GDP shortfall in revenue collection, and this giving a 0.4% GDP increase from RBI coming. Tamanna, I am also taking there will be another interim dividend sometime in February.
Yeah.
Interim dividend has become a practice now, and it will come from RBI. The interim dividend will come in. So I am taking the extra money that is coming in from RBI is about 0.4% of GDP. Now that would in some extent mitigate the shortfall in the revenue collections, which in a slowing economy we will never be in a position to get. Now then the question that arises is that what would the government do? If government wants to maintain at 3.3 or want to go to 3.5, to me it's immaterial, so long as the government is going to spend money on rural housing, expenditure on rural housing, going in for PMGSY, those kind of assets creation, which can increase the rural incomes, which are woefully inadequate at this point in time. Remember, the rural incomes have barely risen by 0.8 to 1%, and the rural wages are almost flat. And this is affecting the rural economy in a very, very big way, and also not helping the FMCG growth. So if this money is put into these kind of expenditures and also coupled with accelerated divestment program of the government and recycling of assets, which is possible to do if you stay focused on that particular number, I am sure there will be enough money to get into these public expenditures, which will certainly be pushing up the rural incomes, and that will mean a further revival in a meaningful way.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Ms. Rajaraman only to comment, if you wish to, on some of the suggestions that we've seen on this panel and how this can really be taken forward. Any comments, ma'am? I think it's only fair that I give you a chance to come back.
I agree with Mr. Gopalan that since recapitalization of banks is being done through bonds, that will not be the use to which this cash bonanza will be put. You know, as far as the Keynesian counter-cyclical push is concerned, any type of expenditure will fulfill the purpose because it's additional expenditure. But as Mr. Gopalan says, there was so much of revenue overestimation in the budget and expenditure understatement in the budget that this bonanza will just help the government to cover that overreach in the budget. The expectation that the fiscal deficit would be at 3.3%, and it will actually help them to keep it at 3.3%. So it will just fill in the revenue shortfall and the expenditure understatement that was pointed out by many commentators at the time of the budget.
All right, interesting point over here. We're also getting details on a bit more of what is actually in that report, and we'll try to get you those details in a bit. But meanwhile, just to surmise that, you know, rightly pointed out on our panel, if there was no context to the kind of statements that have been made in the past by, you know, former governors or the spat which was in the open, maybe we wouldn't have even been discussing in such detail this transfer. It's the context that really makes it most important, and that's why it is a very, very key subject to focus on. We'll take a very short break, but we're coming right back with more on this. Don't go away.